Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take a single step when the entire world expects you to stand still. At the funeral of Pope Francis, under the solemn gaze of history and the silent judgment of tradition, one Swiss guard moved. He didn't move out of rebellion. He moved because of a promise not to an institution, but to a man. One step, one letter, one moment that shook the entire Vatican. Because sometimes true loyalty isn't found in rigid obedience, but in the courage to honor the spirit behind the rules we've sworn to follow. Stay with me, because in 28 unforgettable seconds, he redefined what it means to serve with both discipline and heart. Rome's sunrise was often a magnificent painting come to life, but today the sky hanging over St. Peter's Square was a heavy stretch of silver gray, like a mourning shroud draped over the sacred kingdom. Weak light seeped through the mist, blurring the ancient stones, casting the Vatican in a cold, colorless farewell. Against this heavy backdrop, a vivid splash of life stood defiantly still. Leon Weiss, Lance Corporal of the Swiss Guard, tall and unyielding in his brilliant uniform of blue, red, and yellow, the living colors of 5 centuries of unwavering loyalty. His polished black boots were rooted to the stone, utterly motionless, not a tremor betraying him, as though he himself had turned to stone along with the Vatican. In his hand, the heavy halberd caught the cold rays of light, each glint flickering like the last heartbeat of a fading era. No one among the sea of black-clad mourners, world leaders, cardinals, nuns, and ordinary faithful could have known that beneath the polished steel and sacred colors, a silent upheaval was already taking root within Leon. An upheaval no one expected and no one could stop once it began. The bells tolled from the tower, each somber strike cleaving through the dense mist. From deep within the basilica, the organ's lament rose, low mournful notes vibrating through the stones, resonating like a suppressed sob of an entire world losing its shepherd. And then, like a sacred river flowing from the great doors, the procession emerged. Altar servers with candles and incense, their small faces weighted by centuries of tradition, led the way. Following them were priests in white, bishops in violet, cardinals draped in crimson, an unbroken, sacred tapestry of color moving solemnly through the mist, like vivid memories streaming from the heart of faith itself. Finally, amidst the ocean of rapt eyes and bowed heads, the coffin of Pope Francis appeared, a simple cypress casket, no gold, no elaborate carvings, just humble wood bearing a lone crucifix, exactly as Francis had wished. It spoke more profoundly than any gilded monument. Greatness lies not in opulence, but in humility. Leon did not blink. His breathing, though steady, carried an undertone only he could hear, a rhythm of barely constrained grief. Beneath the breastplate, under the immaculate uniform pressed tight to his chest, something small yet unbearably heavy stirred. A letter. That letter, hidden all morning, now seemed to burn through the fabric, scorching its presence into his very heart. Each heartbeat drummed a silent reminder. Each breath measured the weight of an unfulfilled vow. "Stand still," the ritual demanded. "Remember," the conscience whispered. Leon closed his eyes for the briefest moment, like a soldier offering a final prayer before a battle not against enemies, but against the very tradition he had sworn to uphold. Hundreds of cameras zoomed in. Tens of thousands of eyes watched every subtle move. Leon knew, if he moved, if he broke formation, the entire world would witness. There would be no second chances, no room for explanations. From deep within the basilica, the hymn, "Jesu, Remember Me," floated into the square, fragile, threadbare notes drifting like the last tether holding a soul between two worlds. That sound pierced Leon, reaching into the vault of memories he had long tried to seal away, of promises made to a man who once sat by a sunlit window in the apostolic palace, wearing only a simple white skull cap. Leon opened his eyes. The gaze he now carried was no longer the frozen stare of duty, but something deeper, a light born from a decision already made. In that moment, fate was sealed. 14 years of service had sculpted Leon Weiss into a figure of pure discipline, a man whose presence seemed carved from the same ancient stone he guarded. Behind the sharp lines of his uniform and the stoic gaze, there existed a mechanism as precise as the finest Swiss watch. A mechanism built not only from training, but from a lifetime of believing that every detail, every second, mattered. Leon had grown up in the modest town of Lucerne, surrounded by the steady tick of his father's workshop. His father, a master watchmaker, taught him that true craftsmanship wasn't in the grand gestures, but in the invisible spaces, the milliseconds, the unseen gears, the hidden art of keeping perfect time. Everything matters, his father would murmur, peering through his magnifying glass. The space between seconds is where true mastery lives. Those lessons seeped into Leon's bones. When other recruits struggled with the brutal expectations of the Swiss Guard, unforgiving drills, endless inspections, punishing silence, Leon thrived. To him, precision wasn't oppression, it was a language he had spoken since childhood. In every polished boot, every perfectly aligned stance, every seamless transition of the halberd, he found not burden, but belonging. By the time he turned 37, Leon's record was immaculate. No citations for tardiness, no uniform infractions, not a single lapse in protocol. His commanders admired him, younger guards envied him, and Vatican officials pointed to him as the model of what a Swiss guard should be. If I could clone him, I would, Commandant Schmid had once remarked dryly to a visiting diplomat. And yet, beyond the barracks, few knew Leon truly. Only his old roommate from training days remembered the small, battered wooden clock Leon kept by his bed. A clock made by his father's hands, its surface worn smooth by years of careful winding. Only that roommate knew that sometimes, long after taps, Leon would kneel silently beside his bunk, one hand resting on the clock's ticking frame as he whispered prayers only God could hear. On the morning of the funeral, something shifted. As Leon stood alone before the narrow mirror in the barracks, adjusting his ceremonial armor, his hands trembled. Just once, a fleeting tremor that vanished as quickly as it came. For a heartbeat, he stared at his hands as though they belonged to someone else, foreign and untrustworthy. His reflection, usually as composed as marble, showed a hairline crack. He reached into his breast pocket and touched it. The envelope. The simple weight of it pulled at him, heavier than steel. In the pale light of dawn, standing there amid rows of empty beds, Leon closed his eyes and bowed his head, just for a moment. Not to fix his uniform, not to steady his nerves, but to remember. The Swiss Guard was built on centuries of tradition, on absolute stillness, unwavering gaze, flawless execution. Their duty was more than physical, it was symbolic. In every silent formation, in every rigid line of blue and gold, they became living monuments to the Church's resilience, proof that even as the world changed, some things endured untouched. At a papal funeral, that symbolism reached its zenith. It wasn't enough to stand guard. They had to become stone, timeless, eternal, unshakable. Earlier that morning, in the dim chamber beneath the Vatican, Commandant Schmid had stood before them, his voice low but iron hard. "Today you carry 5 centuries on your shoulders," he said, moving slowly between the ranks of guards. "The eyes of the world are upon you. Not just Catholics, everyone. They will see in your stillness the strength of the Church." His gaze had raked over each man, stopping at Leon longer than the others. "Any deviation," Schmid said, his voice sharpening, "will dishonor not just the pontiff, but the faith itself." Leon had stood frozen in perfect form, but behind the impassive mask his mind wandered, to a different room, a different conversation, to a promise made long ago to a man whose warmth still echoed faintly in the corridors of his heart. "Visual perfection," Schmid continued, "is not optional. If even one guard moves, it will be the only thing remembered from this day." Leon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Schmid stopped directly in front of him, narrowing his eyes. "Something to say, Weiss?" Leon's voice, when it came, was steady as stone. "No, sir." Schmid studied him for a long moment, then nodded curtly and moved on. Yet even as the commandant's footsteps receded, Leon felt the lingering weight of that scrutiny, the instinctive wariness of an officer who knew something was out of place, even if he couldn't name it. As they filed out into the corridors leading to St. Peter's Square, An older officer brushed Leon's elbow lightly. His voice was barely a whisper. "Remember who you served today, Weiss," he said. "Not just the office. The man." Leon said nothing. He simply adjusted his grip on the halberd and kept walking, his boots echoing faintly on the ancient stones, each step carrying him closer to a moment that would change everything. It had started 5 years earlier, on an ordinary May morning. The square had been packed with pilgrims, tourists, and faithful, a tide of humanity swirling under the Vatican sun. Leon had been stationed near the colonnade, standing rigid, scanning the crowd with trained precision, when he heard it, a sharp, terrified cry slicing through the low hum of voices. Protocol demanded that Leon remain at his post. Radio for assistance, maintain surveillance. But something deeper, something older than training, propelled him forward. 15 feet away, a small boy, no more than 5 years old, stood frozen in panic, separated from his parents. Without hesitation, Leon moved, lifting the child high above the crowd with strong, steady arms. Within moments, a frantic mother pushed through the throng, snatching her son with trembling relief. The breach was minor, quickly corrected, unnoticed by most, but not by Pope Francis. 2 days later, a Vatican aide appeared in the barracks with a message. His Holiness requested Lance Corporal Weiss's presence. Alone. Leon had followed the aide through a labyrinth of marble corridors, the echo of his boots swallowed by centuries of stone. He expected reprimand, perhaps dismissal. Instead, he was led into a modest study where Pope Francis sat, not behind a grand desk, but in a simple chair by an open window, sunlight spilling across worn floorboards. Leon bowed deeply. "Your Holiness." Francis smiled, the warmth of a man who had lived too long to care for formalities. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite. Leon hesitated, uncertain. "It's not a suggestion, son," the Pope added, his voice carrying a rasp softened by kindness. Leon sat, his back ramrod straight. "Do you know why I asked for you?" Francis asked, leaning forward slightly. "No, Your Holiness," Leon replied. Francis nodded toward a small monitor nearby, where grainy security footage showed Leon lifting the lost child into the air. "You left your post," Francis said, his tone neither accusing nor indulgent. "Yes, Your Holiness," Leon answered. "I apologize." Francis raised a weathered hand, stopping him. "Why did you do it?" Leon paused, carefully weighing his words. The child was in distress. "So are many who come here," Francis countered gently. "What made this one different?" Leon shifted slightly, the movement so slight it might have gone unnoticed by any other man. "He reminded me of someone," Leon said, the confession dragging itself from his chest. "My brother." Francis waited, silent and still as stone. "When we were young," Leon continued, voice low, "there was a festival in our town. My brother got lost in the crowd. I couldn't reach him in time. He left the rest unsaid, the hospital stay, the broken arm, the long, haunted nights afterward." Francis studied him, eyes gleaming with an understanding born of his own scars. "You know what I've noticed about the Swiss Guard?" he said at last. "You're trained to be seen but not noticed, to stand so still that people forget you're human." He leaned back in his chair, the sunlight etching deep lines into his face. "It's necessary, of course, but dangerous too." "Dangerous, Your Holiness?" Leon asked carefully. "For the soul," Francis said. "To separate duty from compassion is an artificial division. God doesn't recognize it." The conversation shifted then, like a stream finding a softer bank. Francis asked about Leon's family, his hometown, small things that mattered more than they seemed. He shared stories of his own youth in Buenos Aires, not as pontiff to guard, but man to man. "When I was young," Francis said, voice tinged with memory, "I made a mistake. I chose institutional loyalty over human need. It haunted me." He turned to the window, gazing out as if the past still lingered just beyond the glass. "Sometimes, Leon," he said softly, "the holiest thing we can do is move when we are told to stand still." As their time together ended, Francis rose with some difficulty. "There's a tradition in Argentina," he said, offering his hand briefly. "We say goodbye twice, once for the body, once for the soul." He squeezed Leon's shoulder gently. Remember that when the time comes. Leon had left that modest study a different man, though he couldn't articulate how. Like a clock whose gears had been subtly adjusted, still ticking, still precise, but now keeping a slightly different time. And now, years later, as he stood beneath the heavy skies of Rome, that adjustment stirred once more, silent and inexorable, as the final procession for Pope Francis began. 2 nights before the funeral, as the Vatican slept under a shroud of uneasy silence, Leon Weiss returned to the barracks after evening patrol. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of ancient stone and impending change. He moved with the quiet precision of habit, yet a subtle tension clung to him, like a shadow he could not shake. Near the gates of St. Anne, a figure emerged from the darkness, small, stooped, wrapped in a simple cassock that fluttered slightly in the night breeze. Leon halted instinctively, hand tightening on his halberd, before recognizing the familiar form of Father Ventresca. The old priest approached slowly, each step measured as if pacing a memory rather than a road. His hair was white as paper, his skin etched with the deep lines of a lifetime spent in silent service to others. When he spoke, his voice was barely louder than the whisper of the wind. "A moment, guard Weiss," he said. Leon lowered his weapon slightly, nodding once. Ventresca glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot, then withdrew a cream-colored envelope from within his robes. It was sealed with a simple wax stamp. No insignia, no official markings, just a trembling line of handwriting across the back. For the man who once stood guard in tears. The old priest held it out with a hand that trembled faintly, but purposefully. He wrote several letters in his final weeks, Ventresca explained. Most to family, close friends. This one was for you. Leon accepted the envelope, its weight far exceeding its size. A letter from Pope Francis, addressed to him. He said you'd understand the timing, Ventresca added, his eyes searching Leon's face. He said you'd know when to open it. Leon swallowed hard, the stiff collar of his uniform suddenly feeling too tight. How did he know I'd still be here? He asked quietly, almost to himself. Ventresca smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both sorrow and pride. Some men stand guard because it's their duty, he said. Others because it's their nature. He knew which kind you were. Leon stood there for a long moment, the envelope clutched against his chest, feeling the steady hammering of his own heart beneath the armor. That night, he sat alone on the edge of his narrow bunk, the barracks around him shrouded in darkness. He turned the envelope over in his hands again and again, reluctant to break the seal, reluctant to accept the finality it represented. At last he opened it. Inside, on simple parchment without official letterhead, written in the slightly shaky script of a man worn thin by years but not by spirit, were words meant for him alone. Leon, it began without preamble. If you are reading this, I have gone to meet our Father. Strange how we spend our lives preparing for this journey, yet still approach it like bewildered travelers without a map. I have been thinking about our conversation years ago, about the boy in the crowd, about your brother, about rules, and when to break them. In you, Leon, I recognize something rare. A man who stands guard not out of duty to an institution, but out of love for what that institution should represent. Those are the guards we need most, especially when no one is watching. Leon read the words once, then again, slower with each pass, feeling them carve themselves into the deepest parts of him. The world will tell you that discipline means remaining still when everything inside you says to move. Sometimes that's true. But the greatest discipline is knowing when movement serves a higher stillness. If one day you find yourself torn between the letter of tradition and its spirit, remember this. I saw you. God sees you. And perhaps that is enough. The letter ended simply, signed only, Francisco. Leon folded the letter carefully, reverently, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his uniform, directly over his heart. Above the square, the choir practiced softly, their voices carrying the old hymn into the night. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Leon sat in the darkness, the letter warming against his chest, and felt something inside him settle into place. Not peace exactly, not certainty, but a readiness he had never known before. The square pulsed with a silence so deep it seemed to stretch across centuries. Beneath the watchful gaze of statues and saints, under the weary morning sun, the final procession for Pope Francis began its slow, solemn descent. The coffin, carried by 8 solemn bearers, emerged into the light, a simple cypress box, adorned only by a lone crucifix, gliding forward like a vessel carrying the weight of a million prayers. Around it, the sea of mourners held its collective breath, trapped in a ritual so old it felt like time itself had stopped moving. Leon Weiss's stood in formation, halberd held with perfect symmetry, his body the image of Swiss precision. On the outside he was unshakable, a monument clad in blue, red, and gold. But inside a storm raged. The letter pressed against his heart burned like a second sun. Its words echoed louder than the bells overhead, louder than the hymns filling the air. Move when you are told to stand still. The choir's voices swelled, rising into the open sky with aching simplicity. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Leon tightened his grip on the halberd until his knuckles whitened. Around him, the other guards remained statues, perfect, silent witnesses to history. Their stillness was absolute, a sacred vow made flesh. Any deviation, Schmid's voice whispered in his mind, and it will be the only thing the world remembers from this day. And yet, wasn't that exactly the point? Leon's breath slowed, his senses narrowing until there was only the coffin, the cross, and the memory of a man who once spoke of compassion over compliance. In the span of a heartbeat, decision crystallized into action. His first step was deliberate, the sharp click of his boot against the marble ricocheting through the stunned square. Heads turned, brows furrowed, cameras zoomed in. Leon did not falter. The second step brought him halfway to the coffin. The ripple of confusion was growing. Priests glancing up, bishops pausing mid-hymn, cardinals exchanging sharp looks. The third step placed him directly before the simple wooden box, before the legacy it carried. The world seemed to suspend itself. Every camera, every eye, every soul in that square turned to the lone guard who dared to move when all others stood frozen. With mechanical precision, Leon shifted the halberd to his left hand. His right hand moved slowly, ceremonially into his breast pocket. An action so controlled, so reverent, it almost seemed choreographed. From within his uniform, he withdrew the letter. Pale parchment against deep blue fabric, the wax seal visible to those nearest him, a private message now made irrevocably public. In one smooth motion, Leon dropped to one knee. He placed the letter gently atop the coffin, positioning it directly beneath the wooden crucifix, as if offering it to the very spirit of the man within. His gloved fingers lingered for a breath's length. Per il tuo ultimo viaggio, he whispered, for your final journey. He hadn't intended for anyone to hear, but the perfect acoustics of St. Peter's Square carried the words to those nearest, an unintended intimacy exposed to the world. Leon rose, moving 3 steps backward, each one as precise as his approach. He returned his halberd to perfect vertical alignment, his face once again the mask of ceremonial stillness. The breach had lasted 28 seconds. But in those 28 seconds, something ancient had shifted. The reactions rippled outward in waves. Priests crossing themselves, cardinals exchanging alarmed glances, diplomats leaning toward their aides with frantic whispers. Some watched with horror, others with something closer to awe. And yet no one moved to stop him. No guards intervened, no official rushed forward. The letter remained where he had placed it, an unexpected blemish on the ceremony, or perhaps a blessing. In the back of the procession, Father Ventresca watched with tired eyes. A hint of satisfaction touched the corners of his mouth, unseen by all but the angels. Among the Swiss guards, a younger recruit stared at Leon, caught between terror and admiration, witnessing what few ever dared to imagine. And in the great sea of mourners, thousands of faces turned not to the rituals of tradition, but to the quiet defiance of one man. They could not fully understand what they had witnessed, but somewhere deep within, they recognized it. A moment when rigid tradition yielded, not to rebellion, not to chaos, but to something more human. something perhaps more holy. The funeral mass continued, absorbing even the unprecedented breach like a great river, flowing around an unexpected stone. Outwardly, the ceremony resumed its solemn rhythm. Chants rose, incense swirled, rituals unfolded with timeless gravity. But beneath the surface, currents had shifted. Inside the basilica, away from the sea of mourners and the blinding cameras, whispers crackled through Vatican corridors like dry leaves in a restless wind. Cardinals leaned close, aides murmured behind sleeves, officials exchanged glances heavy with calculation. Leon Weiss returned to his position, standing as if nothing had changed, yet everyone who had seen knew everything had. When the final blessing was concluded and the crowd began its slow dispersal, certain figures peeled away from the public eye. Quiet directives were issued. Summons were sent. Leon received his in the most unremarkable way possible. A simple nod from a superior. No words exchanged, only the quiet weight of inevitability pressing down. Later that evening, he sat alone in a narrow antechamber near the Apostolic Palace, the heavy oak doors sealing him off from the world. No clocks marked the passing of time. No windows offered an escape. Only the slow, deliberate beating of his own heart. 73 minutes passed. Finally, the door creaked open, and Father Ventresca stepped inside. "They're ready," the old priest said simply, his voice carrying neither judgment nor comfort. Leon rose without hesitation. Inside, three men waited around a plain wooden table. Cardinal Favreau, prefect for the Congregation of Divine Worship, Commandant Schmid, stripped of his ceremonial regalia, looking smaller without the armor of tradition, and Archbishop Tremblay, sharp-featured and silent, his hands folded like a blade concealed in prayer. There were no secretaries, no recorders, no formal charges, only the quiet enormity of what had transpired between a guard, a letter, and the memory of a pope. "I think we can dispense with preliminaries," Cardinal Favreau said, adjusting his glasses. His tone was not accusatory, merely surgical. "Your actions today," he continued, "were witnessed by approximately 50,000 in the square and billions via broadcast." The words hung between them like smoke. "The question before us," Favreau said, steepling his fingers, "is not what you did. It is why." Leon met his gaze evenly. "I received a letter from His Holiness," he said. His voice was steady, neither defiant nor apologetic. "Written before his death, delivered to me by Father Ventresca 2 days ago." The old priest, standing near the door, inclined his head in silent confirmation. "The letter was personal," Leon continued, "but in it, Pope Francis helped me understand that sometimes our highest duty is not to protocol." Commandant Schmid leaned forward sharply. "You broke your oath, Weiss," he said, the weight of centuries behind the words, "the most fundamental principle of the Guard." Leon held his ground. "With respect, sir," he said, "I believe I honored the deeper meaning of that oath." An uneasy silence followed. Schmid's jaw clenched. Archbishop Tremblay said nothing, merely watching, weighing. From his pocket, Leon withdrew a folded slip of paper, the copy he had made before the funeral. He placed it carefully on the table. Favreau picked it up, adjusting his glasses once more. He read aloud, voice low but resonant. "If one man can carry love into tradition, then let him do so bravely." He set the paper down with a soft, deliberate motion. "These are the Holy Father's words?" he asked. "Yes, Your Eminence," Leon said. Another silence, deeper this time, older. Favreau removed his glasses, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief, a gesture as ancient as the church itself. "The difficulty we face," he said finally, "is not a matter of discipline. It is a matter of truth." He looked at Leon, not with anger, but with the heavy sadness of a man who understood what institutions demand and what they sometimes lose. "The discipline of the Swiss Guard must be maintained," Favreau continued. "Yet Pope Francis often reminded us that mercy requires flexibility." Schmid frowned. "This sets a dangerous precedent." "Only if widely known," Archbishop Tremblay countered smoothly. Favreau studied Leon for a long moment. "Do you believe tradition allows for personal gestures like this, Guard Weiss?" Leon did not hesitate. No, Your Eminence, tradition does not allow it, but perhaps, sometimes tradition needs to be reminded why it exists in the first place. The words fell into the chamber like stones into deep water. For a moment, no one moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, Cardinal Favreau nodded. 3 days later, the decision was quietly enacted. No official announcement was made, no ceremony, no reprimand. Just a plain envelope slipped under Leon Weiss's door before dawn, stamped with the austere seal of the Secretary of State. Effective immediately, it read, Guard Leon Weiss was transferred from the Ceremonial Division to the Apostolic Archives. It wasn't a punishment exactly. It wasn't exile, but it was removal. Leon reported without protest. He traded his vibrant uniform of blue, red, and yellow for the simple black attire of the Archives Division. Gone was the halberd, replaced by an understated insignia marking him as a custodian of secrets rather than a sentinel of ceremonies. The Apostolic Archives were a world apart from the grand vistas of St. Peter's Square. Beneath the Vatican, a labyrinth stretched, miles of ancient shelves heavy with dust, parchment, and the silent weight of centuries. Here time moved differently. It did not race with news cycles or clamor with ceremony. It crept, measured in the slow erosion of ink, the brittle flaking of old paper, the faint must of forgotten knowledge. Leon patrolled the corridors mostly unseen, his footsteps muffled against the cool stone floors. His duties were simple: secure the perimeter, monitor the reading rooms, ensure that nothing sacred disappeared into unauthorized hands. Monsignor Deza, his new supervisor, was a thin, almost translucent man who spoke 6 languages but preferred silence above them all. You'll patrol mainly the outer corridors, he said on Leon's first day, handing him a small ring of keys. No bags permitted beyond the reading rooms. No pens, only pencils. And I won't mention the funeral, Deza added dryly, his sharp eyes studying Leon briefly. This is the Vatican, he said. What happens above stays above. Weeks passed. The great wheels of the church turned on without Leon. The conclave to elect a new pope filled the upper halls with speculation and politics. But deep below, in the stone belly of the archives, those concerns seemed impossibly distant. Here the living pulse of ambition faded. Here only the breathing of history remained. Yet something within Leon had changed. The letter, now buried with Pope Francis, had left a mark deeper than any wound. It had reframed duty not as obedience to form, but as fidelity to spirit. Leon no longer needed an audience. He no longer craved recognition. Each patrol through the endless corridors became a quiet prayer, a walking meditation on all he had been and all he might still become. His fellow guards still nodded to him when their paths crossed, but there was a shift in their glances, a weariness, a caution. Leon was no longer one of them, in the purest sense. He had become something else. Only one, a younger guard named Thomas, dared to breach the quiet wall surrounding Leon. Was it worth it? Thomas asked one evening, finding Leon alone in the small, stone-walled chapel, tucked into a forgotten corner of the archives. Leon considered the question carefully, feeling the weight of it in the dim candlelight. It wasn't about worth, he said at last, his voice steady but low. It was about rightness. Thomas nodded once, as if that single sentence answered more questions than it raised, and left Leon alone once again with the flickering candles and the silent stone saints. Deep in the manuscript section one afternoon, Leon found Monsignor Deza hunched over a delicate document, handling it with the reverence one might reserve for relics. A letter from Augustine to Jerome? Deza murmured without looking up. In it, Augustine admits a mistake in interpretation, says he'd rather be corrected than praised incorrectly. He glanced up then, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. Even saints valued truth over tradition, he said, when they had to choose. Leon said nothing, but something settled deeper into his chest, a sense of quiet belonging. The archives suited him. Some men were meant to guard ceremonies, others were meant to guard history. Leon, he realized, had become the latter. And in this silent, forgotten corner of the Vatican, that was enough. For now. 3 weeks after his reassignment, Leon Weiss walked alone through the Vatican gardens. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravel paths, and the heavy scent of spring blossoms hung in the air, sweet and almost suffocating. A seasonal tour group wound its way through the gardens. School children from Austria, judging by their uniforms, their laughter and chatter, a stark contrast to the solemn corridors Leon now called home. He moved past them like a ghost, almost invisible in his plain black uniform, when a boy of about 10, lagging behind the others, caught sight of him. The boy had unruly dark hair, a pair of glasses sliding perpetually down his nose, and a wide-eyed curiosity that stopped Leon in his tracks. "It's you," the boy said in German-accented Italian. "The guard who moved?" Leon paused, startled more by the certainty in the boy's voice than by the recognition itself. He turned, meeting the child's gaze fully. "Were you scared?" the boy asked, stepping closer, his small voice earnest and unafraid. "When you decided to move?" Leon considered the question, feeling its weight in the warm air between them. "No," he said simply. "Why not?" the boy pressed, frowning. "Everyone said it was forbidden." Leon crouched slightly, lowering himself to the boy's level, his black uniform whispering against the gravel. He saw no judgment in the child's face, no suspicion, only wonder. "Because sometimes," Leon said carefully, "rules are meant to protect something precious. But sometimes, the most respectful thing you can do is recognize when following them would cause harm instead." The boy tilted his head, digesting the words. "My father says rules are rules," he said after a moment. Leon smiled faintly, a curve of lips more sad than amused. "Your father is mostly right," he said, "but no rule is greater than the good it's meant to serve." "Beyond the hedge," a teacher's voice called out, sharp and urgent. The boy glanced over his shoulder, reluctant. He took a few hurried steps, then turned back one last time. "Did the Pope really write you a letter?" he asked, almost breathless. Leon allowed himself a real smile this time, a small, private thing, edged with memory. "Some things," he said, "stay between friends, especially after they're gone." The boy grinned, pushing his glasses up his nose, and ran off to catch up with his group. Leon watched him go, the sun casting his long shadow across the garden path, merging it with the boy's fleeting one for a brief, perfect moment. Then he turned and continued on his way, disappearing once more into the growing hush of evening. To anyone watching from a distance, he might have seemed unchanged, his back still straight, his steps still measured, his bearing still every inch the disciplined guard. But inside, where no protocol could reach, something had shifted permanently. Leon Weiss no longer measured duty by the rigidity of rules. He measured it by the weight of compassion, the quiet pulse of conscience, and the delicate, unseen moments when tradition must bow to something even older. Not a man who had broken faith, but a man who had found it anew. And for now, for him, that was enough. As the evening shadows stretched across the Vatican gardens, Leon Weiss walked on, a silent figure framed by the last golden rays of the dying sun. He carried no banners, no medals adorned his chest, only the quiet certainty that he had acted in accordance with a truth older than any institution. Sometimes true loyalty is not found in rigid obedience, but in the courage to honor the spirit behind the rules we are taught to follow. Leon had not broken faith. He had fulfilled it. And now, dear listener, the question turns gently toward you. When the moment comes, when tradition demands your silence, but your heart whispers otherwise, will you have the courage to move, or will you stand still, guarding the forms of things long after their spirit has passed? Leon made his choice beneath the unyielding gaze of history. One step, one act, one quiet defiance that spoke louder than any sermon. What will yours be?